You know, I feel like the platformer genre of video games has a bit of a bad reputation for being quote-unquote too kiddie. Now, that isn't necessarily accurate. The type of people who make this kind of assessment are the kinds of people that we don't really want to include in the video game discussion to begin with. You know, people who only play the big, realistic, gory AAA games. Even quote-unquote cutesy games can have a lot to offer in terms of quality and content. Just look at Mario's near universal appeal. Everyone loves Mario, and most Mario games are indeed like really well made. They're good. Mario's great. That said, as my gaming tastes evolved over the years, I noticed I tend to prefer the edgier side of the platformer genre. Now, that isn't to say I only like hardcore, intense games for adults or anything like that. It's just that from my personal experience, you know, looking at some of my favorite platformers out there, even the mascot platformers I like tend to be more action or story focused than something more simple and universal like Mario. That isn't to say I can't enjoy something a little bit more basic. 2D Mario is the definition of that, but I can have a good time with something like Mario World or Mario Tree, because those are really fun to break open every now and again, and are pretty nostalgic too. But looking at just my absolute favorites, the cream of crop, games that mean the most to me personally, and that isn't even to say that they're necessarily better, just the games that I like the most. Even something like the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, which I love, even though it doesn't have like a deep story or anything, has really good like atmospheric ambiance in every single one of its stages. The vibes are immaculate, the soundtrack, and all the technical action platforming goodness that is included in those games too. I like my games to feel more like an adventure generally. Whether that means the game having a more engaging story, a believable world, or simply allowing me to break open a giant robot with a sword, I'm here for it, man. I've pretty much spent over a year by now trying to figure out why Mario Wonder didn't really interest me that much, despite being a very good game, all things considered. I've played and seen quite a bit of it already, and it really does seem like a step up from the very excruciatingly basic new Super Mario Bros. Series. But nothing about that game really jumped out at me that convinced me to pay up the $60 and put in the time to play through it myself. For a second there, I thought it might have been the Mario series itself. I might have been getting tired of it. Do I even like Mario anymore? But then I realized that no, I still love Mario 64 for all its vibes, all its nostalgia. I love Galaxy for its grandiose. That's a game that makes me feel like I'm on an adventure. And then there's also the RPGs. My god, I love the RPGs. Paper Mario, Super Mario RPG, Mario and Luigi, all of them are awesome. I love them. Rather, I think is exactly what I just talked about. It definitely is just something subjective that changes between person to person, but I do feel like I just get more genuine value out of games that genuinely put in the effort to stand out in a more meaningful artistic sense. Games that don't fit that stereotype I talked about earlier, platformers all being little Timmy's first ever video game, you know? With that in mind, the uninformed might look at my non-existent favorites list and find it weird that Kirby is in there as well. Externally, Kirby is the definition of that stereotype. If you're not too familiar with it, you see Kirby and it's the most cutesy, most approachable, happy-go-lucky platformer franchise out there. And in many ways it is exactly that. And many people love it for being that. You know, all the time I see people with Kirby tattoos or walking around with Kirby merch. You know, recently we've been seeing a resurgence of Kirby memes, or just Kirby doing something silly like eating that whole ass melon or holding that card. All those gifs from the anime going around too. Kirby is cute and endearing and accessible, and that is still true. But even from the start, Kirby was conceived to be very accessible, yes, but also very deep. The very first game in the series, Kirby's Dream Land, was made to be a simple game that anyone can beat, and it rather successfully achieved that. It's very short, very pick up and play, fits very well with the console it was on, the original Game Boy. But it still had a hard mode for people who wanted a bit more of a challenge from that game, and it pretty much delivered on that as well. Hard mode is pretty tough, and it becomes a genuinely pretty interesting platformer for, again, early Game Boy standards. But the series' definition of what it means to be accessible but deep changed over the years in a lot of very interesting ways. Kirby games as a whole can be kind of categorized into groups or eras, quote unquote, mostly based on who are the people behind them and what time they released. It's not something consistent and precise. I feel like a few of the eras kind of overlap. Originally, we had the Sakurai games, directed by the one and only Smash Brothers man, who also created the Kirby series. That would be Kirby's Dream Land 1, Kirby's Adventure, and Kirby Superstar. And then, meanwhile, and a little bit after that, we got the Shinichi Shimomura games, Dark Matter Trilogy. That would be Kirby's Dream Land 2, Kirby's Dream Land 3, and Kirby 64, which is really just Dream Land 4. Those were very different takes in the series for a few reasons, and they were made by different people. After that, Kirby kind of went on a bit of downtime for the series there. For a while, we only got portable games. That's what I like to call the era. A lot of the mainline games were developed by this external studio, Flagship. Otherwise, we got a bunch of spin-offs and some kind of minor stuff. Some good games, for sure. But the series wasn't really moving forward. In fact, it kind of took steps back from what was developed in Kirby Superstar by Sakurai in his very last game in the mainline series. And then finally, we have the longest running era of Kirby, and also the most recent one. That would be the modern Kirby series. Those games were directed by Shinya Kumazaki, and they're still coming out. This is still going on. I mean, you can further divide modern Kirby into 2D and 3D now that we have Forgotten Land, and possibly many more 3D Kirby games to come, but I would still kind of like group it in together with all the other modern Kirby games. Aesthetically, vibes-wise, direction-wise, I feel like Forgotten Land, despite being 3D, still walks hand in hand alongside every other Kirby game after Return to Dreamland. And over all these different eras, you get to see distinct approaches to the Kirby accessible but deep philosophy. In the Sakurai games, we got to see a very steady evolution from game to game. First, Kirby's Dream Land, very basic platformer, just you can spit out back enemies and swallow them and stuff. And then we went to Kirby's Adventure, which introduced the copy abilities for the first time. For those unaware, the copy abilities, basically Kirby is able to swallow different enemies and then inherit abilities from said enemies. So for example, if Kirby swallows a sword-wielding enemy, suddenly Kirby has a sword and he can play around with it, and it's super fun. And there were so many of them, they were meant to adapt for those hardcore players who wanted to experiment with different sorts of movesets, and that was further expanded on in Kirby Superstar, where said movesets were actually not just pressing B to do a different thing. Kirby Superstar introduced proper different movesets for each copy ability, where you could mix up different directions plus the attack button, and different things would happen, which would eventually lead to the very same type of gameplay that Super Smash Bros. Became kind of famous for. And then we get the Dark Matter Trilogy, and those games are kind of like basically if the Kirby series took a different direction starting off of the original Dreamland. They still have copy abilities, but they work in very different ways from the other games in the Kirby series. Usually in each of the Dark Matter games, they'll have some sort of gimmick that mixes up the copy abilities in different ways depending on if you're riding on an animal friend or if you're mixing them up together in Kirby 64. I also feel like the Dark Matter Trilogy kind of does a really good job with the vibes and aesthetics for the games. They generally tend to be a bit slower gameplay-wise than the Sakurai games and later on the modern incarnation of the series, but they're kind of designed to be the type of game that you sort of take in slowly. You know, Dreamland 3 has this sort of crayon art style that looks really good to this day despite being stuck on the Super Nintendo. And overall, a lot of like the music and atmosphere and vibes just lends to a very dreamlike quality that these games have. And then we have the era, and it's kind of all over the place. Like they kind of went back on the whole let's give each copy ability a different moveset thing that Superstar introduced, and we went like a whole decade without that idea being explored ever again. Pretty much every new game was trying to do its own little unique little thing, but they were still sort of overall kind of basic. That's not to diss on like Squeak Squad or all the pretty good Kirby games that came out around the GBA to DS era. It's just kind of a quiet era for the series, and it's pretty much the only one without a very distinct identity. During that time, Kirby was kind of fine, sort of just existing, you know? Which I would say is the biggest differentiator of the modern Kirby series, because it does anything but just exist. While it can be argued that it sort of does the new Super Mario Bros. Sin of reusing the same engine and kind of assets from game to game, I'd honestly argue that modern Kirby is pretty much the complete opposite side of that same coin. While the Sakurai games are defined by evolution, taking pretty much new steps into making the series more deep with each game, I'd say modern Kirby is about refinement. People like to say modern Kirby started off with Return to Dreamland, but I would honestly make an argument that it kind of already started in Kirby Superstar Ultra, which was the directorial debut for Shinya Kumazaki. And being a remake of Superstar, it pretty much builds upon directly over what the original Superstar established. That means we got back those different movesets for each copy ability. That means we got extra new modes for a game that was already filled with all these different ways to play, because Kirby Superstar is a game all about having many little games in it. So for the remake, they just added more little games, and it's pretty cool. So the modern Kirby games pretty much took that template that Sakurai established with the very last mainline game he developed for the series and just ran with it, only adding more depth and more substance as it went on. There's this thing about the general perception of the Kirby series as far as, the overall public that isn't too familiar with it, that I think is pretty funny. So Superstar Ultra was actually my introduction to the Kirby series. I found it while messing around in the old R4 card that I had as a kid on my DS. It was one of those cards that has like a bajillion games pre-installed in the micro SD, and one of them just happened to be Kirby Superstar Ultra. And while when I first played it, I likely saw it as cutesy at first, because that's exactly what it is. The memory that really sticks in my head about Kirby Superstar Ultra, and ultimately about the Kirby series as a whole, is more of a weird, cool, pretty unique game, rather than just another cutesy platformer. The fact that I just found the game on my own while scrolling through the R4 list probably elevates that to some extent, but Kirby Superstar Ultra really wasn't your new Super Mario Bros. It had these crazy cool looking CGI cutscenes, some very unique and odd character designs for bosses and other creatures around the game's world, and the deeper I got into the game, the more this intensified. Each of the gameplay modes for Superstar gets experimental in one way or another. At one point you're playing like a Metroidvania with this huge map, and another you're doing like this speedrun mode that goes through the entire game and lets you just play it as fast as possible with this cool new character. There's one mode where you're just raiding Meta Knight's ship, and it's literally just an action movie type setting with mid-stage dialogue and set pieces that are fairly striking and memorable. You're just being like this indestructible force of nature. It's really freaking fun. By the end, you're destroying this weird, high-tech, alien, wish-granting clockwork thingy in a freaking shoot-em-up section. And it's all weird and not necessarily scary, but definitely off-putting for what you would initially look at and expect to be just a silly little game for the kids. I mean, I think we're at a point now where everyone kind of already knows about the existence of Kirby lore. It's pretty much a running joke by now, even to the point of saturation. I mean, the series has kind of experimenting with very scary looking final boss designs ever since Kirby's Dream Land 2. We're at a level now that the phrase Kirby kills eldritch horrors has basically lost all meaning and is just a joke around the gaming Nintendo sphere. So I'm not about to just yap about the fact that, oh, the Kirby series has deep lore, like an edgy 14-year-old trying to justify why they still like Kirby despite not being a kid anymore. The lore is deep in some places, it's kind of shallow in others, and acting like purely this quote-unquote deep lore is the whole reason why the series is still good, I feel is a tad immature. What I do appreciate is what it represents, because the fact that the developers went out of their way to write all of these crazy unique stories in the background for each of the games that you have to kind of go look into to properly understand and find out about. It shows vision, ambition, and a general dedication to the fans and a respect to them that you usually don't see in these kinds of mascot platformers, at least ones that present themselves as initially so approachable and cute. If there's one thing the Kirby series loves doing is little callbacks to the previous games, and as a fan I just really appreciate that, as someone who is able to just keep up with it and be properly rewarded for it. By putting in my proper attention into understanding the lore, I'm being rewarded with some pretty neat stories. Going back to Mario as an example here, when Mahito Yokota was starting to compose some songs for Mario Galaxy alongside Koji Kondo, who's of course the veteran composer for the Mario series, he did some tracks to show to Koji Kondo, and in response to those apparently not good enough songs, Koji Kondo said, if you picture Mario in your head as being somewhat cute, erase that. Mario isn't cute, Mario is cool. And that's ultimately what led Mahito Yokota to go back into the grind and start working on some new songs that ended up being in the actual game, and led to the beautiful orchestrated soundtrack that both Mario Galaxies excel at having. Again, I don't really want to turn this into specifically a Mario discussion, but I just love how Kirby pretty much has this same idea. Kirby is cute, it's undeniable, but it's clear that the developers really want to make these games cool too, to make them stand out and be impressive and memorable in some other way beyond just being cute and quirky, making you feel some intense feelings, dread, fear, excitement. It's the whole package. You know, HAL Laboratory nowadays, the studio that's behind Kirby, pretty much only makes Kirby games. They make some other smaller stuff as well, but as far as the big properties go, they pretty much only work on Kirby. And I do wonder if that's partly the reason why they try to cram in so many cool things into Kirby. The point where it's more comparable to something like Mega Man Zero than your Super Mario Bros. I wonder if the developers, because they don't get to work on so many other different games, they want to do like, they have these cool ideas that they really want to put into a game, and since they only make Kirby, well, let's work that into Kirby, and it never feels like they're being held back by the series, or at least very rarely. Hey, Editing Ash here. I found some really interesting things that kind of support my whole argument here. So, you know Shinya Kumazaki, the guy who directs the Kirby games that I just talked about, the modern Kirby games? Well, turns out he has an online presence, and I somehow didn't know about it, but he has like this whole ass blog pretty much, and he shares about like games he's been playing, anime he's been watching, and some art he does, and like this is the type of shit he's drawing. Like, come on! Bro's actually, like, this is Elden Ring fan art. Bro's actually drawing, like, cosmic horror type stuff, and, like, look at this! Look at this! And then you go back to his diary thingy and see what kind of media he likes, and it's like, it's super eye-opening, because he's like, he has some varied taste when it comes to, like, anime and games and stuff. He's very into it, and like, yeah, of course someone in the industry better enjoy what he's working on, but like look at what Bro plays. He plays like Monster Hunter, he's been watching ReZero, the lower down he talks about Final Fantasy, Gundam, Xenoblade, Pokemon TCG, Free-Ran, Silent Hill, Metaphor. It's all these different things. Like, it really, at the very least, paints a picture of someone who's just very enthusiastic about all different types of games, including darker ones and stuff like shonen or seinen anime. It's people joke about Kirby Planet Robobot being just a huge Gurren Lagann reference, but after reading this, I'm like, absolutely sure this guy enjoys Gurren Lagann. He even has like social media and a Blue Sky here. Like, he has an Instagram too, and if you go scrolling here, of course there's a bunch of Kirby stuff, but then you go down and there's like freaking Chrono Trigger fan art, and I believe he posted something when Toriyama passed away too, with Chrono Trigger and Dragon Quest stuff. We go down here, he's like fucking fan art of the best Pokemon game, you know, just nonchalantly like this. It's so cool. This guy has such good taste. There's this overall attention to detail, continuity, world building, and spectacles in the gameplay that can only be appreciated by older or more hardcore fans. Look at even one of the more basic modern Kirby games like Return to Dreamland, and even that has a cool detail. If you read the first letter of all the names of the levels in the game, you'll find out that it actually spells out crowned, which is a tease for the final plot twist for the game where the Master Crown ends up being like this really important thing. Even one of the levels, Nutty Noon, through that level, each of the stages, they develop in a very cool, interesting way where you're basically like climbing this tower into the sky. In each of the stages in the level, they kind of develop and you can get to see like the time of day passing and you getting higher and higher as you get further into the world. And the music that plays in that part of the game is really, really good too. You got this really beautiful, chill, orchestrated type of song, and then this really exciting one that I like to put in the background of a video sometimes because it's pretty adventurous and exciting, and it's not the kind of thing that you would hear in something like a traditional 2D Mario game. Return to Dreamland also excels in this really cool, kind of like almost Metroid-like power trips where they give you the ultra abilities that are pretty much just press a button and do a thing type of mechanic, but they make such cool set pieces with it that I don't even mind. By the end, you're using your ultra abilities to take down what used to originally be these mini bosses that you would have to put effort into to defeat in each of the stages. And in the very end of the same section, they make you cut a volcano in half with a giant sword. Like hell yeah, man! Through that whole game, you're trying to rebuild this starship and you're getting like all the parts for it at the end of each of the levels. But without giving too much away, by the end they make you actually fight a sentient version of that same starship that you were building through the course of the game. There's this really cool sense of stakes when you see the thing you built fight against you in one of the final boss fights. It's pretty cool. And then the remaster for Return to Dreamland, oh my god, the remaster. They added this whole ass epilogue where you play as Magalor, which is this really cool character. And he has like a combo string mechanic and unlockable abilities that you get to mess around with. It's a whole ass 2D Devil May Cry game at that point. It's so cool. Also has this epic final boss. And then the ending of that kind of ties into what we originally thought to be a non-canon spin-off, which pretty much solidifies the existence of a Kirby multiverse in the lore, which I don't know about you. I think that's pretty dope. The modern era is basically where the actual Kirby lore as we know it started to really pick up. I wouldn't necessarily say it's Shakespearean all the time. There's not that much dialogue in it. Sometimes you have to like go digging to figure it out. And it isn't like the deepest story out there or anything like that. But through the little that it does, it's super engaging to keep up with. Even if the bulk of the game is just pure, simple platforming fun, the finale is always gonna be a roller coaster ride where you fight like a god or something like that. And if you go into the boss descriptions and the little details and throwaway text that the games always include, you're gonna find a lot of really cool details about the overall story of the series that make it really, really fun to just keep up with as we learn more and more about these characters, about these worlds. A lot of us fans will pretty much eat up every new breadcrumb of lore from each of the games and all the cool little connections to the previous ones. There's just enough awesome stuff there to keep us thoroughly engaged. There's even some running mysteries, things we're starting to learn about but don't really understand, like the Ion Hero, which is a badass name, the Elements of Chaos, which is something we barely know about. It's kind of a thing, we kind of get it, we don't really. And then there are the Ancients, which are pretty much the big mystery of the entire Kirby series. Who were they, what they did, and in each Kirby game, we get closer and closer to an answer. And I'm not gonna give away too much in case you do want to get into Kirby lore by yourself, but the revelations that we do get by Kirby in the Forgotten Land are the type of thing you would usually see in like a Xenoblade game. The fact that the series somehow managed to make us fans horrified of orange butterflies through a multi-game continuity scheme that left every hardcore fan's jaws on the floor kind of says it all. But part of what makes it all so interesting is how subtle it all kind of is. If you look at other story-heavy mascot platformers, stuff like Sonic or Mega Man X, those have some pretty cool lore too, but they're more blatant with it. They're trying to be dramatic, they're trying to have a story with a lot stronger characterization and character arcs and all that kind of juicy stuff. And what Kirby does is a different approach, one with its own pros and cons. You know, if you look at Sonic and Mega Man X, you can see how much they've already messed it up when they tried to do a cool story, but one thing or another doesn't quite add up and everything falls apart. Individually, a few of these games' stories, not that well written. In that sense, you could say Kirby's approach is kind of better in a sense. You know, people will go on and make fun of, what am I fighting for Mega Man X4 for the terrible voice acting or pretty much everything about Sonic 06's story, but nobody really makes fun of Kirby's story. Sometimes they like to joke about it because it's so absurd, but it never got the punching bag treatment, and that's kind of rare for these edgier mascot platformers. Personally, I would still argue that Kirby could benefit from some stronger characterization and dialogue. I feel like Forgotten Land specifically lost a pretty good chance to do a very strong character arc with Elflin that's just kind of implied. I feel like if they put in more effort into giving that character a little bit more dialogue so we could care about him a little bit more before the things that happened to him by the end happen, that story could have been even stronger. But I do understand the developers' restraint in trying to keep Kirby deep only if you go looking out for it, rather than a story that spits in your face a bunch of dialogue that some players might just not care about. At the end of the day, I do think it's a very impressive balance. And it goes back to the whole idea of Kirby being accessible but deep. If you look at them superficially, cute little games with kinda crazy final bosses. If you actually go out there and look, you'll realize that Kirby is not only deep but accessible in gameplay, and now that the modern series has gone on for so long, the combat is even deeper than whatever Sakurai came up with back in Superstar, as we get some almost fighting game-like commands for some of the attacks for the copy abilities, alongside some pretty challenging modes that really test the limits of this now pretty deep combat system, but also that it's accessible but deep in motif, that doesn't include just the story and the lore, the music too, all the cool callbacks they like to do in the music with all the different line motifs, the depth in the art design for like the backgrounds for each of the stages. It's all mesmerizing. It really is a step beyond, you know? And I think it's honestly kind of beautiful that cute merch, a Kirby cafe with all these delicious sweets that's genuinely so wholesome, and overall, despite everything, all the Kirby story is still leaning on very optimistic and positive messages that can be enjoyed by younger fans, no problem, while still keeping us more hardcore fans engaged through all of these deeper things. It's really not something you see every day. In fact, I think most Kirby fans will agree that Kirby is cute and cool. So yeah, Kirby's pretty goated.